being able to understand some of the genetic ramifications of conditions like FTD. So Jennifer works, I guess, by title for the CNDR, but works with us all. Anyway, Jennifer, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I just have to tell you I am so excited that you're all here with us. It has been such a rewarding experience helping to organize this conference and help bring you all together, and I really hope you get the opportunity to network with one another today and really enjoy your stay here at the University of Pennsylvania. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is first tell you why I think genetics is important related to FTD, then give you a little bit about what we know regarding the genetics, and talk a little bit about genetic testing and genetic research. So why are we concerned about genetics, and what is it about genes that we think is important? I think that one key thing is that once you know a gene that's responsible for causing a condition, this gives you great power to understanding more about the cause of the disease. If you understand the cause of the disease, if you understand the gene, this might help with improving some of the diagnostic tests and in helping us to predict some of the clinical phenotype or the symptoms that may go along with the disease. And once you understand the genetics, sometimes this will lead you to novel therapies and interventions. The other aspect of understanding the genetics is that it helps with individual and family risk analysis, and I know that that's something that many of you are concerned about. And this can also help in terms of predictive testing once we understand the genetics, and using predictive testing for prevention. So in terms of FTD, how often is FTD genetic? Well, it turns out that in about 5% of people or families with FTD, it's purely a hereditary disorder. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And in a larger percentage, about 35%, is what we call familial. And this term sounds a little bit vague, and that's because this category can be a little bit vague. And then about 60% of the time, FTD is purely sporadic, meaning that there's only one person in the family who's affected, and we don't find any other family history. And the role of genetics is probably a little bit less implicated. So just to review some basic genetics, when we say hereditary, one type of hereditary condition can be a condition that has autosomal dominant inheritance. And what that means is that the conditions pass down from generation to generation. You see it in every generation of the family, and it doesn't seem to skip people, and men and women are equally affected. And in these conditions, what usually happens is there's one abnormal gene that causes the disease. This would be an example of autosomal dominant inheritance, where there's a single gene that's being passed down through the family that's causing the condition. And this is a family that has hereditary FTD. And this woman here was diagnosed in her 30s. And when we went back and took her family history, they're able to tell us that her mother had the disease at a very young age, her aunt had the disease at a very young age, and her grandfather, and distant aunts, uncles, and cousins, okay? But you see it in every generation, and you see both men and women equally affected. So that's this 5%, okay? Now, if we look at what's familial, let me talk about that for a minute and give you an example. This might be an example of what we call familial. And this is an individual who had onset at about age 55, was clinically diagnosed with FTD, and when we talk about their family history, what they tell us is that they had a parent who had some cognitive difficulties, didn't have a diagnosis of FTD, didn't have a diagnosis really of anything specific other than dementia, and that they know of one aunt who had a neurodegenerative disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. And when we go back to further generations, we don't find anything. We don't find anything in these uncles or down here in this generation other than the patient who came in. And so I hope you can appreciate the difference, that the information here isn't as clear, it's not as straightforward, there aren't as many people affected, we don't see a pattern for every single generation. And this makes us, we wonder about the parent here who has had a history of dementia, and we wonder if that's related, but we're just not certain. And this is the kind of family history that I would call familial, where we're not certain that there's something genetic going on, but there seems to be something that's more likely than chance alone. And for these familial kinds of family histories, when we think about what might be causing the disease, it's not just genetic factors that we're concerned about. There are also environmental factors, and this is true for the people who fit that sporadic category as well, where there isn't a family history. You say, well, what's causing the disease? Well, we think it's probably a combination of both genetic risk factors as well as environmental. We don't know yet what all of these genetic risk factors are, nor do we understand all of the environmental risk factors, but you can imagine in any one person, the combination of the two may cause the disease. So how do you interpret family history? This is very difficult, and it's very individual, but just to give you some clues as to the kinds of things that we look at, one is how many family members have the same or a similar condition. And this can be very difficult to interpret, and so we try and dig as hard as we can into old medical records and get information to confirm diagnoses in other family members. We need to make sure that they don't have other common conditions that can also look like dementia or cognitive decline or neurological disease. Sometimes early age of onset can be a clue that there's a genetic problem or more of a genetic influence causing the disease. Sometimes things like a more rapid or severe course, as well as the presence of multiple conditions in a single individual, so somebody with FTD and ALS or FTD and Parkinson's disease. So in that 5% of people who have a hereditary condition, we actually know of a specific hereditary FTD, and we call it FTD P17, and that's frontotemporal dementia with Parkinsonism linked to chromosome 17. That's where that name comes from. Again, this is a hereditary condition, follows dominant pattern of inheritance, and in this group of people, their condition is caused by mutations in the tau gene. And of the hereditary families, this condition makes up about 25 to 40%. So this is just a schematic of chromosome 17, and the gene is in this region, and this is another schematic of the gene. And so if you think of a gene as a book, each of these would be chapters in the book. These little boxes make up the coding, what we call the coding region of the gene. This is the substance of it. And this gene needs to be coded correctly. So all the words in the chapters need to be spelled correctly. And the gene is actually made into a protein, and we call the protein tau. And you've heard other speakers talking about the importance of tau, and sometimes we can distinguish FTD subtypes by how the role that tau is playing in the brain cells. And so this is sort of how you can see the genetics coming together with understanding the underlying causes of the disease. And we're still working on a lot of this. We don't have all of the answers yet. And so just to review that this is specifically a hereditary subtype linked to chromosome 17. There are specific mutations that have been found in the tau gene. And I'll show you what I mean by a mutation in a minute. But these different mutations can directly influence how tau accumulates in the brain cells. And folks with this condition have a very specific profile when we look at the brain cells. We can see specific forms of the tau accumulating. And again, this is back to my book analogy. Here are your chapters. And you can think of this as the individual words. And what we actually find are misspellings in the DNA or mutations in the DNA. And part of our genetic research is actually doing a complete spell check of the entire gene. And there aren't just 100 letters, there are thousands and thousands of letters. And this is a monumental task that our lab undertakes in trying to take a close look at this gene. It takes a long time. And these are just some examples of mutations that have been found in some of the families, not only here in, at the University of Penn, but at other labs around the country as well. So we went over most of this, but again, the important thing is that the mutations in tau can cause different accumulations of tau in the brain cells, and that has been incredibly informative to us as we try and figure out what's causing the disease and some different phenotypes. Some exciting news is that I told you that only about 20 to 25% or 25 to 40% of people who have a hereditary form of FTD have tau mutations. Well, that tells you that there are other genes that must be involved in causing this disease, and literally within the past few months and weeks, there are 2 new genes that have been identified as potentially linked to FTD. And I just put their names up here, but this is mostly just to bring home the point that we're really at the cutting edge of this. We're finding out new information all of the time. And our focus now is to figure out what the story is behind some of these new genes that are being identified. So this is kind of how the picture looks right now. So if you take everybody with FTD, there are going to be some people who, a small percentage, have a hereditary disorder. And of those people who have a hereditary disorder, it is about 25 to 40% of people might have a tau mutation, and then there are all these other genes that have been linked, most of them, though, really only in single case examples. So these are not playing a huge role at this point, but they are helping us understand more about what causes the disease. For the people in the familial or the sporadic category, we are looking for the genes that act as risk factors. The gene doesn't specifically cause the disease alone, but might make somebody more susceptible. We don't know what those risk factor genes are yet, but that is part of our research. We do think that that's important. And just to give you an idea, I know many of you very well, you've participated in our genetic studies, so I just wanted to give you an overview of what's gone on in our genetic studies. We've accumulated blood samples from more than 150 families, and when we look at our families, it turns out that we have found mutations in tau or PS1 or another gene called VCP in 5%. Another 7% I've labeled as probable, so I've already changed my nomenclature on you. But those are people who look like they have a dominant family history, looks like we should be able to find a gene that causes the disease, but we haven't been able to find that abnormal gene yet. So these are people who we really think have a hereditary condition, but we haven't been able to specifically figure out the whole story. These are the people that I would put in that familial group. These would be the sporadic families. And then 15% I called unknown. And these are cases where there's a family history of adoption, and so we just have very limited information available to us. Or the family history just isn't well known, and we're still investigating, working with the family to try and get more information. So just to show you where we were earlier, we're using this genetic information to help understand the cause and how that's going to help us with diagnosis and developing of new medications and treatments. And now I'm going to switch gears and spend a few minutes talking about, well, once we have this information, how can we use it to help answer your questions about family risk? If we understand the genetic contribution to this condition, we will hopefully be able to, for the symptomatic person, develop a diagnostic test, something that helps tell you, yes, this is what's going on. The benefit of that is not only to give you information and give you a diagnosis, but maybe that'll help us predict things or know more about the specific symptoms somebody may have, or what we call the phenotype. It will also help us when we get to clinical trials for new drugs. It may be that people with different genetic profiles may have a better response to certain types of treatments, or based on a genetic background, your likelihood to be responsive to certain medications will be influenced. We can also use this information to talk about genetic counseling for at-risk family members. Unfortunately, right now, there isn't a whole lot that we can tell most of the families, but I know it's something that you're all anxious to learn more about. And hopefully that will be part of what comes of our research in the future. For people who don't have symptoms but want predictive testing, it's kind of a double-edged sword. You want the information, but what are you going to do with it? And where we are right now, without having a specific therapy or prevention, it's a little bit of an ethical debate. It's a little bit of a social issue. There's certainly a lot of emotional risks and benefits to knowing whether or not you're at risk for something. And so it comes down to a very personal decision about whether or not people are going to want to know this kind of information. However, you know, I'm an optimist, and I like to think that as we develop these tests, we will hopefully have those preventions and those treatments, and this is going to be an ongoing process. But today, November 2005, it's mostly a personal kind of issue, and for most people there isn't even a test available yet, so it's still a little bit of you know, an academic, what would you do if it were available? But for the few families where tau testing can be informative, for those at-risk family members, it's really a very personal decision. And part of what we think is important to helping you make those personal decisions is education, finding out why you want the information, what are some of the risks and benefits. Risks meaning, is there a discrimination risk if you know this information ahead of time and we don't have a treatment? Are there emotional risks? Are you going to be able to handle the information? How are you going to, you know, incorporate this into your life and in a meaningful way? And making sure that people have the appropriate support as they go through this process and finding out genetic information. Where we're at right now, and what most of you have helped us with, those families who come to Penn, are our genetic research studies. And those research studies specifically are helping us find those genes that I mentioned and figuring out the hereditary versus the familial versus the sporadic, and how genes play a role in risk factors. As a part of that process, we're also working with you to figure out what's the best way that we can provide genetic counseling to you to help you understand and learn this information and make the best use of it. We have our genetic research studies aren't just in FTD, they're also in Alzheimer's disease and ALS and Parkinson's disease. And we work together as a team because we believe that this information, as we learn about one disease, it helps us with the others, learn more about the others. And Beth and I are both here, so you should pull us aside. And I'd like to leave you with a parting thought, and that is that Thanksgiving is National Family History Day. And this was actually designated a year ago. So if you didn't know about it, you're not out of the loop. It's a new thing. But there is a lot of education coming out of the Surgeon General's office about family history and the importance of documenting your family history and keeping it in a safe place for future generations. And this doesn't mean just when people were born and where they lived. This is talking to them about the illnesses that were in the family, what people died of. And there are lots of tools available for you now to help you collect this information and ways to store it, not just on the computer, but, you know, sample letters and questionnaires you can send out to family members. And so the Surgeon General's website, as well as the National Society of Genetic Counselors, have tools online that you can use to help you gather this information. Barnes & Noble, there's a whole bookshelf on family history tools, and I would really encourage you, even if you don't have a family history of FTD, this is a very important thing that you can do for your family for all aspects of your health and wellness. And at this point, I would like to open it up to questions.